Okay, well, good morning, everybody. My name is Dave Robinson, one of the co-chairs. We're going to go ahead and kick the meeting off. We are still waiting on a couple of members, but there's one action item that we can delay until one of those members gets here that creates a quorum for us. A little bit of housekeeping before we get started. The technical difficulties are preventing us from live streaming at the moment, but it is being recorded, so it'll be available later on. And we would just ask that all the board members, when you speak today, if you could state your name when making a motion or a second, or if there's a comment that you have to make. It's just helpful if you have your name stated prior to making your comment or your motion or your second. We're going to start with a call to order, and then I think I'd like to just go down the line again and have everybody just do a quick introduction of who they are and who they represent. And if we could just start, I think, to the left, that would be super helpful.
Edward.
Hello, Aisha Martin Walton with the Department of Justice.
Anna Rick with the Department of Justice.
Allison Elgart with the Department of Justice, Attorney General's Office.
Nancy Beninati, also with the Department of Justice, but I would like to take this moment, if I could, with the co-chair's blessing. I would like to introduce Anna Rick, who is our new Associate Government Program Analyst. You did also meet Aisha Martin Walton at our last meeting, but I just wanted to, if I could, just give a quick overview. Aisha has been with had been with the Attorney General's office for 28 years, serving under several Attorney Generals going back to the Van de Kamp era. When, in 2001, she was appointed by Attorney General Bill Lockyer as the chief of the California Community Relations Service in the Crime and Violence Prevention Center, and she successfully established a state and local multi-agency safe passage partnership program. So she has, dedicated her career at senior levels of the Department of Justice, and so we are very, very pleased to have her here. It would take me quite a long time to read her many accomplishments, but I want to thank her for joining our team. And I also want to introduce Anna Rick, who has joined our team after coming from a very interesting program where she conducted research studies regarding migration, governance, and education in indigenous communities with regard to child and adolescent workers and labor trafficking in Mexico. Before that, she was the LGBT coordinator for the California Rural Legal Assistance, Rural Legal Assistance. And she worked on students' rights, workplace discrimination, immigration and asylum programs, as well as looking at health disparities as part of her advocacy there. So again, as with Aisha, Anna has many other accomplishments, but we are very excited to have both of them joining our team. And I just wanted to give the board members a little overview of their background, as we have in the past with some of our other staff, just so that you have a better understanding of the high quality that folks that we have helping to support this board.
Thank you. Edward Medrano, I work for the California Department of Justice. I'm a former RIPA board member. I've been reappointed to take the seat that was vacated by Angela Sierra when she retired.
And good morning, David Swing from Morgan Hill Police Department, representing the California Police Chiefs Association.
Warren Stanley, Commissioner, California Highway Patrol.
LaWanda Hawkins, Justice for Murdered Children.
Andrea Guerrero, Alliance San Diego.
Good morning, Douglas Oden, Law Offices of Oden and Green. I'm an attorney in San Diego, California.
Good morning, Sahar Durali, Board Co-Chair and Neighborhood Legal Services of Los Angeles.
Good morning, David Robinson, Kings County Sheriff, representing the California State Sheriff's Association.
Good morning, Steve Raphael. I'm a professor at the Public Policy UC Berkeley, and I'm a gubernatorial appointee.
Hi, I'm Kevin Walker, and I work at the California Department of Justice in the Research Center.
Trent Simmons, California Department of Justice Research Center.
Good morning, Christine Sun from the California Department of Justice.
Well, thank you, everyone, and welcome. There's going to be a slight agenda adjustment today. I do know, at least for sure, we have one member that's going to have to leave a little bit early, and we want to kind of take a look at the overall draft report sooner rather than later, because that's really the meat and potatoes of what people want to talk about. And so the item number 4, the subcommittee reports, are really going to be combined with the item number 7, board discussion of 2020 draft report, and those will be moved up. So the draft report's going to be moved up to the item number 4 after the update from the Department of Justice, just for everybody's understanding. We'll take up the minutes after the next board member shows up. So I think at this point, we'll move to the update from the Department of Justice. Who's handling that one, Nancy?
Hi, everyone. This is Allison Elgard from the Department of Justice. Welcome. We're glad to have all of you here. The main update from us is that we have a draft report and that we're very excited about and really looking forward to hearing everyone's comments and feedback on. We want to thank everyone from the Research Center and all the board members and all of the subcommittees for all of their hard work in making this report draft happen. And we're just looking forward to hearing the discussion and comments from everyone about the report. And this year's report is the first year that we have the stop data analysis from the Wave 1 agencies, the 8 largest law enforcement agencies in California. And so this is the first year, momentous occasion, first year that the stop data analysis is included in the report. So we're excited about that. And I know Kevin and Trent will talk a little bit more about that analysis. But the report has content from all of the different subcommittees, the civilian complaint subcommittee. So we also have data and analysis the civilian complaints, and a review of the civilian complaint forms of the Wave 1 agencies. We have a review of the policies of the Wave 1 agencies, their bias-free policing policies. We have information on post-training. We have information on calls for service and bias by proxy. And we have the stop data analysis. So we're excited to get everyone's feedback on the report.
So thank you, Allison. And I think Allison mentioned this, but I just want to, again, thank the members of the public for submitting comments to the board. We were able to pass along all of those comments to the board, and they were very helpful. I do want to update the board on the 2 items that were, well, 3 items that were discussed at at our last board meeting. There was a request from the board to ask our DOJ retained experts to attend today's meeting. We reached out to our experts. Unfortunately, they had prior commitments and were not able to attend. They have seen copies of the stop data section and the report, and they are continuing to work with us. So I just wanted to pass it along. The other 2 items there were 2 specific vote items, one being the proposed letter to Dr. Weber or the legislature, and then the other item being the Attorney General opinion. I passed along to the co-chairs that the Attorney General's office is not able to provide an Attorney General opinion on this particular issue because what the question and how it was framed would actually not be in line with one of the areas in which the Attorney General's office would be able to provide an opinion, and that is because we do not evaluate the validity of federal law. what we are being asked to do by the board was to make a determination and to tell essentially law enforcement whether to follow state law or federal law, and that is not a basis for upon which our office would issue an opinion. So I do want to pass that along. And then we did, however, provide the letter, the draft letter, working with both the co-chairs in drafting the letter to the legislature. And although we don't have necessarily a specific action item on that letter today, the board is able to vote to determine whether or not they want that letter sent, or whether or not they have modifications or edits to that letter.
I would suggest, Nancy, on that one, if we could just give the members a chance to read that at some point today and then maybe bring that item up later. I had one little language or word addition that I wanted to just bring up, but if maybe after a break, everybody can read through that letter. It's about a page and a half, and then maybe we can take action item, take that up later on in the meeting, if that's okay.
Yes. And I also just want to kind of lay out that if the board decides that the draft of the report today is in a very fine shape, that they feel that they do not need to have the December 9th meeting, the board can take up a vote to allow the rest of the wordsmithing, have you will, be done with the co-chairs and between staff, and there would be no need to have that meeting. But that is just an option and up to the board.
Nancy, if I may make a note, Dr. Lofstrom actually is here from the Public Policy Institute of California. You may have snuck in there after you took a look, but we do have one of the research consultant experts here with us today, so he's in the audience right here. So.
Fantastic.
Yes.
We want to kick it over to Kevin and Trent now.
I think Aaron wanted to say a few words first, just as by way of update,
Okay.
and then Kevin and Trent can take over.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Erin Choi, and I'm a manager within the Department of Justice as part of the team that works with agencies for the submission of stop data into the statewide repository. So I know there's a lot of detail for the board to dig into today. I promise this will be brief, but we just wanted to provide a quick update on the status of some related activities that we're working on. So at a high level, these are the discussion topics. You should have handouts, copies of this presentation in your packets, and there's additional ones here at the front table for members of the public. So just to kind of level set, as was mentioned, currently the 15 largest agencies in the state are underway for the collection of stop data, and they're listed there on the screen or in your handout. Year to date for 2019, so far we've received over 900,000 stop data records submitted into the statewide repository. And I've highlighted that since we last met in the end of September, San Diego Sheriff's Office has started submitting their records. And then we've also been working closely with the remaining agencies and expect to receive additional agencies to start submitting their data before the end of the year. Technically, the records are not due to us until April 1st of 2020, but we just wanted to share this information as kind of a measure of confidence that many agencies are well underway of getting their records submitted prior to that deadline. Something that we provided a brief update on at the last meeting was also to let you know that we were conducting lessons learned sessions. So we brought together the 15 largest agencies as well as agencies that are preparing to come on board, and we met with them over 2 sessions, one in San Diego and then also one in Sacramento that was hosted by the CHP for us at their facility. So thank you so much for helping us make those arrangements. And this kind of gives you an idea of some of the talking points. We had over 45 attendees representing over 20 agencies at those sessions. So we had very wide-ranging discussions. Some of the highlights that we pulled out of those sessions and we'll be following up on is they gave us great feedback on what would be helpful for training in the future. Some of that was to ensure that training is scenario-based, that we'll be developing all different types of training modules. We have a formal classroom type of training and some online short webinars, but further expanding that, so developing content that would be 30 minutes or less and something that agencies could utilize kind of on demand through videos or webinars. Some of the other feedback that they just kind of shared as advice for agencies that would be coming on in the future was to start the reporting process prior to April 1st. Most of the records that we receive at Cal DOJ have been successfully passing validation, but when you're sending records back and forth between systems, it's not uncommon to encounter some type of system error. So just some advice they passed along to future agencies was to make sure that they allow time for that error resolution, system correction type of process. And then something else just to kind of pass along to have on your radar is that some agencies shared that they have added additional fields to their local collection systems. So there's some cases where they felt that it would be important to add context to the stop data that they're collecting. So some examples, indication to indicate whether or not the officer had a perception of the person before they stopped the car. For example, if the person was a resident of the jurisdiction or not, and then related to the reason for stop, including additional information to indicate if the person was deemed to be potentially harmful to themselves or others. So that just gives you an idea that for agencies who are using their own local systems, they are doing some customization and in some cases collecting additional data. Just quickly, some other work that we have in progress at Cal DOJ. We have 2 additional agencies that have elected to start collecting the stop data early. So they are going to be coming online prior to their legislative mandate to do so. And that includes Bakersfield PD and the Los Angeles School District PD. So both of these agencies are going to start collecting stop data effective January 1st of 2020. So we are very heavily working with them right now. For Bakersfield PD, they're going to be using the Cal DOJ hosted web application. We'll be going on site meeting with them to do some thorough training on that web app in early December. And then for Los Angeles School District, they have developed their own local application, and we've been testing it with them over the last 6 months. So both agencies appear in good shape to start collecting the data early as of January 1st. And then we are developing a post-certified class, and there's mention of this in the board's report, but if you have any questions, please let us know. It's something that we're kind of working in partnership with the Research Center and also the Civil Rights Enforcement section, and then my team on the application. But long story short, we have been working closely with Post, and that we're hoping by the midway point of next year to have a post-certified class that would provide an overview of the reporting and submission requirements. And then for the first part of next year, we'll be working with agencies to schedule a series of meetings to look at potential enhancements to our web application. It's performing well overall, but my mindset is if we can reduce one click that an officer needs to make, the system could be more efficient and save them time. So that will be a big push that we're making in the first part of 2020. And then we're also getting ready to do more meetings with the next group of agencies that are coming online. And this is what that timeline looks like. So the next group of agencies would be due to start collecting January 1st of 2021. So for the year of 2020, we'll be working closely with them as they decide how they're going to collect and submit the data to us, do testing, and et cetera, et cetera. That's going to be based on the size of the agency as of January 1st of 2020. So we don't know exactly who's going to fall into that third group yet, but we will know very shortly. And it looks like it's going to be approximately 10 agencies. And then for the final wave, it will be over 400 agencies. So we have started communications with them just because of the sheer volume of agencies that are going to be in that group. If you have any questions, I'm available. Several members of the team are available here. Otherwise, thank you for your time, and I'll kind of defer to your other topics for the day.
I have a question. Edward Medrano from DOJ. With regard to the additional data that's being collected by some agencies, is there been any thought given to having us look at that data as well, or are they just keeping it themselves? What is the process and what are they using it for exactly?
Some of them are using it just for their own local analysis or to push out on their own local open data portals. So it's not something that they're currently submitting to Cal DOJ, but it is something that the local agencies have, and they may be using for analysis, or they may be using their own local publication of the data.
It'd be interesting to see if the research center would find any of that data helpful. Even though they're not required to submit it, it'd be interesting to provide more context to the discussion.
Yeah, I actually had something to add on that too, and my question was more, do we know if that data is being captured right after the officer made the stop, or is that something they're adding after the fact? Because I would caution against using it as context if it's data that's inputted after the fact.
My understanding is that their officers are collecting it at the time of stop, that they just have modified their own local form to include it. But it does bring up a good point. As we were kind of going through and digesting the feedback that we received from these lessons learned sessions, possibly things to consider. I know last year the board invited several members, like agencies, to come and provide you updates about what they're doing. That may be something that would be helpful in the future, especially now that we have more agencies coming on board, giving them an opportunity or offering, if they're interested, to come and provide the board updates, or also developing some type of survey questionnaire to collect more information about what the agencies are doing in a more formal way. Anything else? Okay. All right.
Thank you, Aaron.
Thank you.
Appreciate it. Are we going to Kevin and Trent now?
All right, thank you. Hi again, I'm Kevin with the California Department of Justice Research Center. We also have Dr. Trent Simmons here, who's also from the Department of Justice Research Center. And as I mentioned briefly earlier in the audience here, we also have Dr. Magnus Lofstrom, who is a policy director and senior fellow at the Public Policy Institute of California, which is the independent research entity that we have been working with to get advisement from regarding the report contents for the stop data analysis this year. So he's also here with us today. So thank you for making time to make it out here. We appreciate that. All right, so let's see. Today I'm going to kind of just give a rundown of the stop data analysis portion of this version of the draft of the report that you've all got today.
Kevin, could I have a quick question real quick? Is what you're going to go over, a lot of that's in the draft report. Is it possible for you to refer us to like a page if you have that? So that way, we're creaking our necks to look backwards. If it's in front of us, we can look down.
Yes,
if not, that's okay. I just wanted to ask.
I will try to. Also, maybe Trent, as you see topics pop up, if you could try and look through and let me know which page, just because I haven't mapped it directly to the presentation. It roughly follows the order of the draft content that we have, but I don't have exact page numbers. I can try and flip through at the same time.
It might just be easier for us to turn around then.
Okay,
Thank you.
it may be easier. I'll try to use the little laser point. Can we all see this? Yeah, I can try and use this on there as well to point stuff out, but yeah, it may be easier just to turn around. Sorry. I didn't realize that the room setup was like this. I don't work out of this office. Okay. So as I was saying, I'm going to go through basically the draft content that's included in your in the draft of the report that you've all got in front of you today. Start with a brief breakdown of the stop demographics that we also went over at the last board meeting. Then we're going to go into the newest part of the report drafting section, which is this pre-stop data analysis section. Those are a lot of the analyses, one that we weren't completed with conducting at the last September meeting, and also that we've included in response to board member requests at the last full board meeting, as well as some of the subcommittee meetings that have occurred in between that last full board meeting and today. And then we're also going to go back over some of the post-op data analyses that we talked about last time, because we know that there are some members that weren't able to make it last time, so we want to go back over that information. And then I'll talk about some of the supplemental analyses that we've also put together for you all. One for the appendix sections, and then two, we also have like a supplemental document that we've put together that contains a lot of information that we put together in response to some of the comments from both board members and members of the public. So to start out, we'll first go over just some summary information as a brief refresher. During the data collection period last year, so from July 1, 2018 through December 31st, 2018, the department received stop data records on over 1.8 million individuals. The California Highway Patrol reported a majority of the stops for the data collection period, with the second most stops coming from the Los Angeles Police Department, third most coming from the LA County Sheriff's Department, on through the rest of the Wave 1 stop data reporting agencies, on down to the San Diego County Sheriff's Department, reporting about 40,000 stopped individuals to the department. So we went over this last time, and so this is a recap on the racial and ethnic breakdown of the stopped individuals. We saw during the data collection period that Hispanic individuals were the group of individuals who officers had the most stops of, followed by white individuals, then black individuals with 15-ish% of the stopped individuals, then Asian, Middle Eastern / South Asian individuals, multiracial individuals. The second least stops occurred of individuals who officers perceived to be Pacific Islander, and then the least frequent ethnicity group for officers to stop was Native Americans. And I'll note that, again, that all these categorizations of individuals on race ethnicity are based on officer perception rather than having the stopped individuals themselves self-identify, and so how officers perceive people may not always be how individuals perceive themselves to be. But what we have data on is officer perception data. We'll return to a similar graphic to this that incorporates some feedback that we received from the board and some requests from the last board meeting here in a second, but just as a brief recap on some of the primary reasons for why stops were conducted during the data collection period. We found that the most common reason for officers to initiate stops was that in response to a traffic violation, constituting about 85% of the stops during the data collection period. This was followed by stops where the officer had reasonable suspicion to believe that the person was engaged in criminal activity. The third most common interaction reason between officers and the stopped individuals was that the encounters started as a consensual encounter that eventually resulted in a search. That was about 2.2% of the stopped individuals. And then all of the other reasons that we collect RIPA stop data on, the reasons for stops, so those being that the person was known to be on supervision, known to have a warrant, the officer was conducting a stop to check if the person was truant, and then the two student-specific stop reasons to see if the student's conduct warranted discipline under the education code, or that whether or not the student's conduct violated school policy. All of those together constituted less than 2% of the stopped individuals during the data collection period. We can see that the stop reasons varied a little bit by race ethnicity group, where we have, for all groups, that the most common reason why officers initiated stops with them was in response to traffic violations. but that varied from that being the least common for Black individuals and most common for Middle Eastern or South Asian individuals. Black individuals had the highest proportion of their members of any of the race ethnicity groups stopped for reasonable suspicion. So this is just a brief breakdown. I know that we went over this information last time, but I just want to restate it for people who weren't able to attend the last meeting. So the next slide, we have some information that we collected in between the last full board meeting and this board meeting. And so board members requested that we source some information on residential population information to display side by side with the distribution of individuals who were stopped during the data collection period. And so what we have here is a graphic that displays with the darker red-ish maroon bars the proportion of each of the race ethnicity groups that we collect information on for RIPA and their stop distribution there in those bars. And then we also have side by side with those bars, the lighter bars, the distribution of those populations in the residential population of areas that are served by the Wave 1 agencies. And so in order to pull this information together, people may remember at the last board meeting that there was some discussion surrounding how to go about doing this to make residential population information mirror the Wave 1 stop agencies a little bit better. And so Dr. Raphael had an idea at that meeting, and we followed through with that idea and worked with Dr. Raphael to work out the methodology to do this. But essentially, we sourced information from the American Community Survey, which is distributed each year by the United States Census Bureau. And what we did is we sourced the most recent year of information that we could get at the time when we were conducting this analysis or pulling this information together. And that was last month when we were doing this after the September meeting in October. And so the most recent year that was available at that point in time was the 2017 American Community Survey. So I'll just note that this is the light bars are reflective of 2017 data as opposed to 2018 data, but this was the most recent data that was available in October of 2019.
Is this chart in material?
I'm sorry? Yeah. So the information contained within this chart is in Table 2 of the report. It's on page 17. It's in tabular form. For the purpose of the presentation, we thought that it's easier to look at a bar graph, but in the report it's in a table. But it's the same numbers. Yes, so it's on page 17 in the report for anyone following along in the report. And so we sourced that information that's on residents and the populations of the various areas throughout the state, and they collect this information, the Census Bureau, for the entire country. And so what we did was we isolated data that was derived from residents of areas where Wave 1 agencies serve. And so similar to what Dr. Raphael proposed for us to do at the last full board meeting for the police departments in Wave 1, we looked up their respective city populations, and for the sheriff's departments in Wave 1, we looked up the residential population of their respective counties, and then for the California Highway Patrol, we paired their data with the entire state's population information. And what we also did was provide a weighting scheme that Dr. Raphael helped us come up with to weight the data so that it is more reflective of the number of stops that each of these agencies conducted during the 2018 data collection period. And so in that way, we were able to account for agencies like CHP making more stops during the data collection period, and therefore the population that they serve being represented in the population data that we present side by side with the stop data at a higher rate. So here you can see that a lot of the bars are close to being similar. However, the two largest differences in percentage point differences occurred for Black individuals. You can see here in the stop data represented 15.1% of the stopped individuals in 2018, but in the weighted population data that we sourced from the Census Bureau, they accounted for 6.3% of the residential population of the Wave 1 areas. And then also for Asian individuals, they had the opposite relationship here. So they represented 5.5% of the stopped individuals during the data collection period, but in the weighted residential population information that we sourced, they represented 11.9% of the residents of the areas that Wave 1 agencies patrol. And so just a couple caveats here over here in the text box on the side. As I mentioned before, these data were collected during 2 different years, so we should keep that in mind, as well as the information that's collected in the American Community Survey does not perfectly map one-to-one with the stop data that is required to be collected for RIPA. And so an example of that here is there's an other category over here. You'll notice that this is a 9th racial ethnic category on this graphic. In the American Community Survey, they allow respondents to identify as other on their race or ethnicity. In the stop data collection, we do not collect information or allow people to identify themselves as other, or sorry, officers to identify stopped individuals as other races or ethnicities. And so we couldn't group that into one of the other categories here, the other 8 ones that we do collect information on. There are also some smaller differences between the two. The American Community Survey collects information at a very granular level as far as race ethnicity is concerned. And we did our best to map those race and ethnicities to the groups that we utilize for RIPA. However, there were some groups that are explicitly stated in the RIPA data regulations, such as individuals who officers perceive to be Israeli or Afghani, that we did not have categories for in the American Community Survey data that we were using, and so we were unable to identify those individuals. But the only cases where we observed that there were explicit ethnicities that were stated in the RIPA regulations, but we didn't find in the American Community Survey was for this Middle Eastern / South Asian group. So for the most part, we were able to map these from the American Community Survey one-to-one with the RIPA stop data. And so this is a snapshot of the residential population information of the areas where Wave 1 agencies operate in comparison to the distribution of the stop data for 2018. We also have an additional form of population information that we also collected to provide as context for the 2018 stop data. That information being here on this next slide. So this was an idea that came, that I believe a member of the public mentioned at the full board meeting in September, but to use traffic collision information as an approximate proxy measure for the population of drivers on roadways. So there is precedence in the literature, both in stop data research, but also other uses that have to do with traffic conditions for using individuals involved in traffic collisions as a proxy or an estimate of the population of individuals who utilize roadways and operate vehicles on them. And so what we did was, in order to source information on who becomes involved in traffic collisions, is we collected information that is stored in the statewide integrated traffic record system, or SWITRS for short. This information is maintained by the California Highway Patrol. Yes.
I'm sorry, this is a tremendous amount of methodological detail, and I'm wondering if we could just go into the meat of it, and then if there are questions, you can come back more.
Okay, yeah, I can be a little bit more brief about
That's my
the
opinion.
methods.
Others may want every detailed methodology.
Yeah, I think that's probably, you know, something that the entire board should weigh in on before we just automatically switch over.
Oh,
So-
okay. Thoughts on?
Yeah, I think it's okay. I think, especially because members of the public might not have had a chance to fully digest, but you can keep it going, keep it moving.
Okay. Yes, I will.
Maybe?
I'll try to keep it snappy. All right.
Yeah.
So we sourced information. The California Highway Patrol maintains this information. It's a database that contains information on traffic collisions and the information on parties that are involved in traffic collisions that law enforcement agencies respond to the scenes of. And so what we were able to do was to isolate data submitted into this system from the Wave 1 agencies and traffic collisions that they responded to, and identify the parties that were determined not to be at fault in these traffic collisions. The idea behind electing to look at data from not at fault parties is that Anyone who pays for insurance knows that there are certain groups that pay higher rates, and that's for a reason, because they're more likely to be involved in collisions, and so as to lessen the probability that we would be biasing our data by including individuals who are at fault in collisions and making it overrepresentative of, say, individuals who are younger or males who tend to be involved in traffic collisions more often. We looked at only the parties who are determined not to be at fault in these traffic collisions. And so similar to what we did with the American Community Survey data, we sourced the information from each of the reporting Wave 1 agencies and the traffic collisions that they responded to, and broke down the racial and ethnic distribution of the collisions that each of those agencies responded to, and then also weighted it so that it was more reflective of the number of stops that each of these agencies made during the Wave 1 data collection period last year. And so here again, we have in the darker bars on the left for each of these identity groups, we have the group's distribution in traffic of the stopped individuals who were stopped for traffic violations. So we isolated traffic violations because these are collision data, and therefore it makes the most sense to compare them to people who were stopped where we can assume that they were likely in a vehicle. And so the distributions might look a tiny bit different. You'll notice here that this is 40% for Hispanic people, whereas in the other slide it was about 39%. So that's why those rates change a little bit. And then we have the left bars that are lighter that represent these individuals who were determined not to be at fault in traffic collisions in 2018. And so again, here we see a similar, I should note that there are less race ethnicity groups in this graphic because SWITRS doesn't collect as granular of information as the American Community Survey, and so we had to do some grouping. Some of the RIPA groups are categorized into this other group in this one. But again, here we see a general trend that there's rough parity along these bars here for these two groups. However, black individuals, again, had a higher representation in the stop data than they did in the collision data, and the opposite was true for Asian individuals who had a lower representation in the stop data than they did in the SWITRS collision data, which is, again, a proxy for driving populations. So I won't dwell too much on this one anymore, but that is a second alternative form of comparison data that we pulled together in between the last full board meeting and this one to provide some context for the board to consider. Just to kind of go over some of the considerations and limitations of using this type of data, and I have this for all of the methods that we'll go through today. So this isn't specific to the population-based comparisons, but just some considerations for people to think about when reading these sections is that residential population information has a series of limitations, one being that there are differences in how the two data sets, one being RIPA and the other being the American Community Survey, are collected and how data are categorized. A second consideration would be that the data were collected across 2 time periods, which I mentioned before. We've mentioned this in previous meetings, but stop data are not only collected on individuals who are residents of the areas in which they are stopped, and then another consideration would be that racial and ethnic groups may differ on unmeasured factors that may affect their probability of being stopped. And that is a common thread throughout almost all of the methods that we'll talk about today. Similarly, SWITRS has some of the same limitations in that the data could be categorized differently between the two systems, that RIPA stop data don't explicitly differentiate stops of vehicles from stops of pedestrians. So we have to use a proxy measure, which is basically individuals who are stopped for traffic violations, where we assume that a majority of these individuals were in vehicles. Which party was at fault could be misidentified in some specific cases, and so there could be some individuals who are in the SWITRS data that were labeled as not at fault when in actuality they were at fault. And then similar to the last limitation there for the American Community Survey data, racial and ethnic groups may differ in their probability of being stopped for one, a traffic violation, and then also being involved in a traffic collision. So these are some of the considerations to make when considering these types of information, these population-based benchmarks. And so there's been some discussion of an additional method that was outlined in the last year's report, the veil of darkness method of looking at stop data and pre-stop decisions. I know that some board members will want to discuss this member in the discussion portion of today's meeting, but we have concluded or finished up some of the analyses that we were working on at the point of the last full board meeting, so we're just going to run through those for you today, then you all can discuss how you feel about this method before. But this method was created by two researchers, Groger and Ridgway, who were doing a study in 2006 using Oakland Police Department vehicle stop data. And the method was designed to kind of sidestep some of the limitations to using population-based benchmark information. And basically, the veil of darkness method aims to contextualize stop distributions rather than using population-based information, but by using differences in civil twilight information. And I'll define civil twilight on the next slide. But it basically means lighting conditions outdoors due to changes in sunlight availability. And so the veil of darkness assumption assumes that evidence of racially biased stops would be most apparent during daylight when race is presumably more visible to officers prior to initiating a stop. But the VOD, or veil of darkness approach, compares the portion of stopped individuals that a given race or ethnicity constitutes during daylight hours to their proportion during darker hours. So we can kind of go through a little bit. I will try to make this part as painless as possible, but if people want to cut me off because I'm being too technical, feel free to speak up. But the veil of darkness methodology restricts or examines stops that occur during what the original researchers that developed this method called the intertwilight period. And the footnote at the bottom of page 19, footnote number 31 in the board's report or draft, right now has a definition of civil twilight. So they look at the period of time between the earliest end of civil twilight and the latest end of civil twilight. And civil twilight is defined as the illumination level sufficient that most ordinary outdoor activities can be done without artificial lighting before sunrise or after sunset. So this basically means that the time of day when the sun has gone down and there's still that orange glow around that people can use to illuminate things and still do outdoor activities has ended. It is now dark outside, and so we don't see that, essentially, is when the end of civil twilight is. And so what we look at is a period of time across the data collection period, and this is an example graphic that's on the screen right now that is taken from a location in San Francisco. And so what we can see here is that at the beginning of our data collection period in July, it gets dark at around 8:30 in San Francisco, and due to daylight savings and standard time, and there is a change here, that drop on November 4th, and that the earliest time of civil twilight ending is towards the end of the year in December. And so what we do is identify the stops that occur between these two time periods and compare the distribution of stopped individuals that are stopped in the sunlight. So these stops that would have occurred during this time period here, under the blue line here, to the stop distribution amongst the various race and ethnicity groups to the people who were stopped in this time period here, where it was dark. We sourced civil twilight information from the United States Naval Observatory. That is the original data set and source that the original authors of this method utilized as well. So that's in keeping with previous research. And so going over some initial descriptive results here. So this looks at the full 6-month data collection period and the stop distribution between the light and dark conditions in 2018 by race ethnicity group. And what we see here is that there's overall, considering all groups' data aggregated together, there's nearly a 50-50 split between the proportion of stops that occurred in the light and the proportion of stops that occurred during dark conditions, with the light constituting 50.1% of stopped individuals and the dark conditions constituting 49.9. So very 0.1 off on obtaining parity there. And so if we look at this,
Can I ask a quick?
yes.
These are all stops happening from roughly 4 to 8?
So in the inner twilight period, technically the earliest instance of civil twilight, I believe, for a given location in California during the data collection period was like, I think 4:54, I think, and then the latest occurrence in the data collection period was like about 9:30, I think exactly 9:30. But
What varies is basically the cutoff between daylight and darkness, depending on the time of the year, and daylight savings time.
right,
Okay.
yes. And so we see that for white individuals, they had a 50-50 split between stops made of white individuals in the light and in the dark. And most racial ethnic groups, racial and ethnic groups, were close to 50-50 between light and dark. However, Hispanic, multiracial, Native American, and Pacific Islander individuals tended to be stopped during the light hours of the inner twilight period, a bit more frequently than the dark hours, and the opposite was true for Asian, Black, and Middle Eastern or South Asian individuals. The greatest difference was for Pacific Islanders, who were stopped 57% of the time of the inner twilight period in the light versus the dark. Yes.
I
Sorry.
have a question about this methodology, because, so, is it that, does this account for the fact that the law enforcement officer, it might not be how they see the person in the car, or rather that there are certain neighborhoods that get over-policed, and does this account for that distinction?
No. So that's one of the limitations of this approach, as well as other approaches. This goes back to some of the, let me go back to, it's listed again, but I think we're closer. So here that racial groups may differ on unmeasured factors that may affect the probability of being stopped. One of those factors being that officers may tend to be in certain neighborhoods more often than they are in other, and so these areas are differently policed, and therefore the probability of just encountering a law enforcement officer is different in different areas. And so that's a limitation of both the benchmarking approaches as well as the veil of darkness method. Does that answer your question here? I see that we have another one from Andrea.
Yeah, thanks for all of this analysis. Thanks for incorporating the traffic collision data that the member of the public provided. I think that's fascinating. The veil of darkness analysis, I think, is problematic in the context of the data that we're analyzing, especially given the skewed data that we're getting between CHP and the rest of the agencies. So the veil of darkness data is based on traffic stops or traffic violations, right?
Yes.
And not on reasonable suspicion stops.
Correct.
And so given that the data set that we have, 1.8 million stops, is comprised of 1.1 million CHP stops, that already is a big chunk, right? It's 57% of the data. And somebody had suggested from the board that we break out the CHP data and look at that separately because of the skewed results that we can get. I think that's especially true here when you consider the fact that CHP stops were 99% based on traffic violations, and you take an agency like San Diego Police Department, nearly half of their stops were based on reasonable suspicion. So it's very different. So you're only capturing what's happening with, say, half of what's going on at SCPD and all of what's going on at CHP with a volume in the CHP data set that's enormous, right? So I think I have other concerns about veil of darkness, you know, the ambient light, urban areas for the Wave 1 agencies, the presumptions that are at play. But I think my biggest concern is how the data set that we're using of traffic stops, you know, all of the concerns and limitations and factors just go through the roof because of the way the data set is skewed. I would urge the board to consider dropping this at this juncture unless we are willing to look at just the reasonable stop data. I think we get a wholly different answer.
I would support that. I agree, and I would hope that, I know we're gonna have a discussion about the report, and I know there's a limited amount of time, but if the CHP data could be disaggregated across the board. And then what I heard you saying, Andrea, was in fact, I guess that's the first step, right? And then within the remaining reporting agencies, are you also saying we want to disaggregate reasonable suspicion stops from traffic stops to look at that within each agency and aggregate it across the agencies?
Well, I think if we're going to use veil of darkness, and I think
I meant overall, whether veil of darkness or anything else.
On anything else. I mean, I think it's worth doing because we have such widely varying numbers between the percentage of stops based on traffic versus reasonable suspicion. Even among, like LAPD is, 72% of their stops are based on traffic, which is different than San Francisco. So we could be getting very different kinds of data that aren't telling us what we need to know that's meaningful and actionable.
So I guess just for question, because I support this direction, what specific, so do we want DOJ to, across the board, including Twilight, for all of it, disaggregate CHP or disaggregate traffic stops from reasonable suspicion stops across the board?
Could I make a suggestion that we table this and get through the presentation? So when we get to the discussion, we'll all have microphones in front of us and can chime in?
Yes.
Okay, continue on, Kevin. Thank you.
Okay. Just to kind of touch, since we've already kind of moved the conversation onto some of the considerations and limitations of this approach, I'll just address them here shortly. So Andrea mentioned artificial lighting being a factor, and that is a limitation of this approach because artificial lighting is available under many stop conditions and can hinder the ability of darkness to lessen the ability of officers to be able to perceive someone's race prior to initiating a stop. So that is a consideration that artificial lights do exist. One of the reasons why we restrict to traffic violations is that traffic violations generally are vehicle stops, right? And people generally operate their vehicles outdoors, whereas where the assumptions of the veil of darkness that sunlight availability would affect an officer's ability to perceive someone's race or ethnicity prior to initiating a stop would hold true most often of any of the different, so as opposed to being indoor stops, right, where some of the reasonable suspicion stops may occur indoors, and so that's one of the reasons why those stops are excluded from this form of analyses, but you are correct that by not considering those, that this analysis does not speak to reasonable suspicion stops, and it is specific to those stops that are traffic violation stops. Those do constitute a majority of the stops that were conducted during the data collection period from CHP, absolutely, but also most of the other Wave 1 agencies, also a majority of their stops were traffic violations, but we totally acknowledge that there are large proportions, as you've mentioned, for some agencies that were conducted for reasons that were not traffic violations, and so those aren't included in these analyses. So those are included in the other analyses that we examine in this version of the report, but VOD is not for those conditions. And so, yes, that is a valid critique of the method. So I guess I think I skipped a couple slides here, but yes, so we also, utilizing a statistical model that the original authors of the VOD, Groger and Ridgway in 2006, utilized to predict the odds of individuals being stopped in the dark being an individual of color relative to the odds of that person being white. So we used the same statistical model that the original authors used. It's also been repeated since this was first employed over 10 years ago. As recently as this year, there was a study from some researchers at Stanford University that utilized a variety of different methods, one of them being VOD, and we used the same method, statistical model as them. We actually borrowed some code from them because they open sourced that code, so thank you to them. But the results of those analyses displayed that both multiracial and Pacific Islander individuals had lower probability of being stopped in the dark compared to whites, and that the opposite was true for black individuals. As an alternative method of employing the veil of darkness assumptions, we also did a difference in difference test where we identified a 2-week period before daylight savings changed to standard time in November, and 2 weeks after. And so there was an hour during this data collection period where for the 2 weeks before the change in daylight savings, all stops that occurred in that hour were stops in the light, and then abruptly, due to us setting our clocks back on November 4th of last year, all the stops that occurred in the 2 weeks after November 4th last year occurred in darkness. And so we compared the difference in each race ethnicity group's stop distribution in the 2 weeks before to the 2 weeks after, and then we also did the same comparison for what we called 2 control periods. A light control, which was an hour during which it was light for the full 1 month period that we examined, and then a dark control, which was the opposite, that was dark for the whole month. And the results of this analysis showed that the shift in time due to daylight savings generally decreased stop frequencies for all groups except multiracial and Pacific Islander individuals who generally had higher stop frequencies in the treatment hour than the control hour. So you'll note that those 2 groups were also the groups that we found were stopped less frequently, or had differing probabilities from white individuals to be stopped in the dark here. So that, and then we've kind of went over some of the considerations and limitations already in our discussion. I think I missed one here before. Just this bottom one, that racial and ethnic groups may differ on unmeasured factors that affect their probability of being stopped for traffic violations. So that's similar to many of the other approaches that we'll look at today, or that we have looked at, and then the final method that we also are going to look at here. Yes?
A clarifying question. So in the first analysis where you use the intertwilight period for the whole year, you're seeing stopping of African Americans a little higher when it's dark out. And then in the difference in difference analysis that you just described, we're seeing everybody has their stop frequency declined when the light is turned out. Is that correct? And is there a relative change for the groups? Like, is that decline larger for one group relative to another, or is it just that you see?
So that information is available in the technical report. Trent, do we have the table number for that?
Yeah, I can look that up.
I don't have it in front of me. It's not included in the PowerPoint presentation, so I don't actually have the numbers for each of the groups individually in front of me. But that might be.
I think it's actually the opposite. So in the veil of darkness analysis, African Americans are stopped at a higher rate during the day, during the night than during the day. That result is the opposite of the first 2 analyses, one based on residents and population, and one based on.
Right, in the overall one.
I got that.
This was
Yeah.
a specific
There's a
question to
second
the difference in
analysis
difference
here where
test.
That's not what's happening. There's a second analysis, and this second analysis actually I think is more convincing. The difference in difference, because you're really comparing a narrow window around the same time.
Right, it creates like a quasi-experiment where you only look
And
at.
that doesn't appear to be the case anymore.
Right,
So
so-
everybody is, which kind of, makes you wonder that there are 2 different ways of implementing the same strategy, and you get.
Right,
different answers.
they both utilize the same theoretical framework,
Yeah.
but by looking at different sections of data and doing a different test, you get varying results. So it is interesting in that way, but it also complicates the interpretation. Okay, so moving to the section of the stop data analysis that largely we've talked about at the last meeting, but this is a recap for people who weren't able to make it to the full board meeting. We're going to talk about some of the post-stop outcomes. Mainly, we explore search rates and measures of search efficacy. And so during the data collection period, 9.9% of individuals were searched during stops. Although you can see in this figure here that search rates tended to vary by the race and ethnic group of the stopped individual, search rates being highest for black individuals with 18.7% of black individuals that were stopped during the data collection period being subjected to a search, with the group that was searched least frequently being individuals that officers perceived to be Middle Eastern or South Asian, with 2.8% of those individuals being subjected to a search. White individuals fell with the third least frequent searches of any of the race ethnic groups, with 6.5% of stopped individuals who officers perceived to be white being searched. So we also looked at the basis provided for search. The most common basis that officers provided for conducting a search was that the search was conducted in an administrative fashion, incident to arrest, which is one of the search bases that officers are able to provide. And then we also, we went over this at the last full board meeting, but we also, in keeping with another study that looked at search rates, broke out the search bases into what we considered or categorized as higher discretion searches and lower discretion searches. And so we categorized searches where officers provided one search basis for conducting the search, and that one search basis was just that they received consent from the individual, as higher discretion searches. And lower discretion searches were searches that were mostly procedural in nature and were conducted either incident to arrest for inventory purposes, same thing for vehicle inventory searches, and search warrants where they already have a judicial order in hand before conducting the search. And we found that this isn't in this figure. You can actually see that we changed it based on board member feedback at the last board meeting. People didn't like those stacked bar charts, so we made these two pie chart, so hopefully that's better for people this time around. But you can see here that the distribution between who was subjected to searches that were higher and lower differed. So you see here that in the higher discretion searches, you have a large population of, large sample of Hispanic individuals, and then that shrinks a little bit for the lower discretion searches. And there are differences between the proportion of black people that were searched in higher discretion searches and lower discretion searches, and then also for whites here in the yellow bars. So yes?
Would probable cause, is that embedded in lower discretion? Is that implied in the language there?
In lower discretion?
Yeah.
Lower discretion here is just those three search bases.
So
So there are other search bases that officers can provide for conducting a search, such as the person was on supervision, had a search provision, et cetera. And so there are other search bases that are not categorized in either one of these two groups. Trent, do you have that number there? I can get you the proportion of cases that didn't fall into either one of these groups.
Yeah, I see it in the report.
Okay.
I'm wondering where probable cause would fall, since that would be a big factor.
All right, so probable cause, there's no express distinction of searches that were made for probable cause. So there are a variety of factors or search bases that can be probable cause searches, but the other search bases we could not infer from just the data whether or not it was a probable cause search in every case, and so it was harder to basically group all of the searches that were for probable cause into a single group. And so we didn't have like a extant research that we could basically model our analyses after that did that. So we did, in response to some of the questions that came up at the last board meeting, include a table in the technical report that has the search yield rates for each of the search bases listed separately. And so for those other search basis types that aren't included in either higher or lower discretion, the categories here for discretion level, you can actually view the search hit rates for every single search basis individually in the technical report. So that was kind of our way of trying to provide that information without making assumptions about which of the search bases constituted probable cause and which ones did not. So that was our way of attempting to give people the most information that we could without making assumptions regarding the data. And so, Trent, do we know could we look up what the table number is in the technical report, just so you can just tell me here in a second here. I'll continue, but just let me know when you have it, and I can tell people which table that is in the technical appendix.
I think it's table 11.
Okay, there we go. Table 2.11 seems like. So then, in addition to looking at just the rate at which the different race and ethnicity groups were searched, we also did an examination of how frequently the individuals who officers searched from each of these groups were found to be in possession of contraband or evidence. We now call this a yield rate. It's the same thing that we were talking about last time. It's how often a search, we presume, yielded contraband or evidence. So we were calling it hit rate before, but now in the report you'll see that it's called yield rate. It's the same exact, it's calculated the same way, it's just a difference in terminology. Trent, do you have the?
Yeah, 37.
Okay, yeah.
Page 37.
Okay, it's in page 37 of the technical report, that basis for search yield rate table that I was mentioning before, for anyone who's interested. So search yield rates were calculated as the number of searched individuals who were found to have contraband or evidence divided by the number of searched individuals. And then you just multiply that by 100 to get in terms of percentage points. And that's how all of these were calculated. So these results will look familiar to everyone who was at the last board meeting. However, search yield rates varied by race ethnicity group, with Middle Eastern, South Asian individuals having the lowest search yield rate and white individuals having the highest search yield rate. Yield rates were lower for all racial groups of color compared to whites by a margin of 1.8 to 5.6 percentage points, dependent on the race ethnicity group that we're examining. So we also changed these graphics in response to board member feedback. Last time they were there was a line that represented white search rates, and then we had bars that extended either above or below, dependent on where the search rate of the various race ethnicity groups fell in relation to white individuals. But the feedback we received was that they wanted that people would like a more simplistic depiction of the data, and so here we just have a simple bar chart that displays the search yield rates by race ethnicity group. And so whites, as opposed to being a reference bar, are now just the bar here at the very right of this graphic. We also examined search yield rates by discretion categories that we talked about already in search rates. We found that all racial groups of color had lower yield rates for higher discretion searches, and that most racial ethnic groups of color had lower yield rates for lower discretion searches relative to white individuals, the exception being black individuals and Native American individuals having slightly higher yield rates on lower discretion searches. So a discussion of some of the limitations surrounding utilizing search yield rates. RIPA data don't likely capture all observable factors that may influence an officer's decision to search an individual. And so because we do not collect information, all the information that officers have available to them at the time when they decide to initiate a search or perform a search, we are not able to account for all factors that may influence that decision. And also, it's the case that racial and ethnic groups could differ on these unmeasured factors that officers use to identify individuals they believe to be in possession of contraband or evidence, and so that could complicate interpretations as well. In addition to the search rates that we talked about and the yield rates that we talked about at the last board meeting, we added an additional form of post-op outcome measures and analyses to this version of the report. And those are an examination of enforcement rates, which, similar to search yield rates that look at how often officers uncover contraband or evidence when they search individuals. This looks at just the proportion of individuals who either receive a citation or are arrested of the stopped individuals from each race or ethnicity group. And so it's calculated similarly to how we calculate search yield rates, but it's not looking at searches anymore and yield rates. It's looking at how often people are being arrested and or cited. And so here, we found that officers took an enforcement action, which, for anyone who's familiar with the stop data regulations, there are 4 categories in the result of stop variable that we consider enforcement actions. So those being that an officer made a citation for an infraction, the officer issued a citation and release, the officer made a custodial arrest pursuant to a warrant, or the officer made a custodial arrest without a warrant. And so all of those together, we found that 60.3% of individuals received one or more of those result of stops, an enforcement action of some type. And this varied by race or ethnicity group, with the group with the lowest enforcement rate being black individuals, with 51.6% of black individuals having an enforcement action taken at the end of their stop, and ranged up to the enforcement rate for Asian individuals, who had a 68.7% enforcement rate. We also broke this down by not aggregating all enforcement types together, but rather breaking out citations for infractions separately, and that's what's displayed in this graphic here. So the blue bars here represent citations for infractions and the rate at which each of these race ethnicity groups received citations for all of their stop members. And then the orange bars in this graphic represent arrest rates. So they were either subjected to a custodial arrest or received an in-field cite and release for an arrestable offense. And so we found that this also varied by race ethnicity group, but we did find that Black and Native Americans had relatively low citation rates for infractions, but that these groups had relatively high arrest rates when compared to other race ethnicity groups. So they had some of the lowest citation rates for Black and Native American individuals here. You can see that their bars are much lower than the rest, but that their bars for arrests tended to be higher than the remainder of the race ethnicity groups. And so that was an additional post-op factor that we also looked at and broke down by race ethnicity in this draft of the report that we didn't report on last time because we hadn't completed this analysis. In addition to the content that's in the report draft, there's also an appendix section that we've distributed as well. Those are all tables that are required for the report to include in for the board to include in their report that are aggregate counts of agency level information by calendar year. And so, Trent, would you mind passing my little folder there? The folder, because I've got the code section in there. So the board has to include information pursuant to Penal Code 13519.4 dictates that specific agency level totals be included in the board's report. And so that appendix covers all of those agency level totals for the reporting period this year. And so that we created that so that interested parties can view those agency level tables as well. And then we also created a what we call a supplemental technical report. Trent, can I just hold that as an example? Thank you. Yes.
We have a couple minutes till public comment.
Oh.
How much more time do you need?
This is my last slide.
Awesome.
So I'm just talking about, briefly. We also included a supplemental technical report, and that's this document. It's a large document, but it is in response to a lot of the comments that we received at the last meeting that people are interested in looking at information broken down by some of the identity groups that were not included in this version of the report, the main body. So looking at the identity groups that are not race ethnicity. So in the technical report, you can actually view a lot of information broken down by the other identity groups, such as gender, LGBT identities, approximate age, limited English fluency, and disability types. So this contains a lot of information broken down by those identity group types. You can see yield rate information for all of those groups here as well. And then this also includes a section that's dedicated to breaking down the types of analyses that we've produced in the report by each individual agency, which I believe is where Andrea was getting some of those figures from earlier, right? So you're able to find them in the supplemental technical report. So you can view agency-specific analyses in the technical report. So that's what I have for you today. Feel free to discuss. We're here to answer questions, but I'm going to go sit back down.
Thank you so much. So the board is going to have an opportunity to discuss the report. So right now I would like to open it up to public comment. Everybody has 3 minutes. We have 30 minutes, so please come forward. Hi.
ACLU of California. Thank you so much for this opportunity to provide comment, and to the Department of Justice for this analysis. I'm going to try to get through my points in 3 minutes. First of all, I wanted to follow up. We sent a letter to the board and to the Stop Data Subcommittee making a couple of points about some of the technical analysis, including just a couple of objections to the Veil of Darkness methodology, some of which were addressed here in the presentation, but that we just kind of wanted to reiterate and re-urge that, the issues that the Department of Justice discussed and that we discussed in our letter we think are very real. So I'll just quickly run through a couple of points. So we really applaud the use of, or the inclusion of this contextual data as we discussed in our comment in the last meeting and in the letter. And we would really urge that not just in the technical report, but that also in the report itself, we see some disaggregation of CHP data and agency level data for a lot of the reasons that Andrea Guerrero mentioned, that we really think that the CHP data might be in a different category all on its own. Moving a little bit to the kind of Veil of Darkness issue. So we mentioned, of course, the ambient lighting problem, the problem that driver behavior is affected by presence or absence of law enforcement, and the neighborhood problem that Mr. Ali mentioned as well. Because so many of the Wave 1 agencies are urban policing agencies, we think these problems are actually exacerbated with the methodology, and we think maybe even push it to a point where, echoing some of the comments that I think I heard, it might not be worth including that kind of specific methodology in this report. Picking up again on a comment that we already heard, I wonder why, if the department has an explanation for the kind of disparate outcome we see with the initial Veil of Darkness methodology that was discussed and the other contextual methodologies, and what we see from the hit rate data information, which suggests some evidence of bias, right? That first Veil of Darkness method doesn't show. I'd be curious to know if folks who've thought about this have thought about whether there's a reason for that and what to make of that in the report. Again, we only just saw the report at the beginning of the meeting, so I'm trying to do my best to process and articulate comments at the same time. But we really think that this is the analysis portion is the meat of the bill. It's the meat of what we're trying to do here, and I would really urge the department to spend as much time and space in the report as necessary to make sure that this agency level data is disaggregated, that the right methodologies used, that we're providing explanations for what we see the limitations are. Because again, that discrepancy really jumps out at me. I wonder if it's because of the CHP data, but it might not be, and I'd be curious to know a little bit more. Just reacting quickly to what I've seen, we think it's a really big omission to leave out reasonable suspicion stops of vehicles in thinking about the Veil of Darkness analysis, especially when the department's own data, as reported, shows how disparately reasonable suspicion stops of vehicles affect Black folks, people of color in general, but Black folks specifically, as evidenced in the report. And omitting that category where we already see quite a large evidence of bias just based on the numbers themselves in the Veil of Darkness analysis, I think kind of fatally skews the data that we're seeing in the Veil of Darkness analysis. So I'd really urge to reconsider. I'm seeing my time. I've got a 1-minute call. Okay, last few things. The CHP data I already said. Okay, the other thing is where possible, some of these graphs that are in the PowerPoint but that are presented only as tables in the report, I would also urge that kind of visual representation so that folks have a little more access to understanding. And then the last point, we included again in the letter that we sent a couple of additional categories of post-op kind of yield rate analysis that might be useful. In particular, thinking about categories like officer safety or weapons as kind of high discretion searches, and thinking about what the definition of high discretion really ought to be if it's beyond just consent in order for it to be useful. Also, reasonable suspicion as a potential high discretion stop category or search category, to make sure we're understanding what that difference really encompasses between high discretion and low discretion if it's to be a category other than simply consent encounters or consent searches. Because if it's just consent, then I would question the utility of calling it high discretion instead of just calling it consent and the utility of that contrast. So those are just a quick couple of points. I really appreciate the opportunity to provide comment, and of course appreciate the department and the board for the robust analysis and the data here. So thank you very much.
Thank you.
Good morning. My name is Michelle Wittig from the Santa Monica Coalition for Police Reform, and I would just like to encourage the drafter of the statistical analysis sections to tell the reader what the statistical outcome means, not just what the statistical outcome is. And I don't mean to interpret it, but just tell the reader what the implication of each of the results is. Give them a little extra hand rather than just assume that they know because a statistical analysis turned out this way, that somehow they can interpret it just at the very basic level. This is what it means. The direction of this result shows that. That would, I think, help a lot of people who maybe didn't take Statistics 101 or even 200. Thanks.
Anybody else? Last call. All right, should we take our break now then and come back? Okay, I think that's on the agenda. So we're a little early and we had contemplated a 30-minute break. So right now it's 11:35, so 12:05? Yeah, okay, thank you.